Well, good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. My name is Laura Roden, and welcome to the session. Our session is called The New Normal of Corporate Finance in a Post-COVID World. And we have a wonderful selection of panelists here today to speak on this subject. You all in the audience have the information on their detailed bios, but I'm going to do a quick overview as well so you get a sense of the perspectives that they may be bringing to the session. First, I'd like to say that all of our panelists today are alumni of San Jose State University, and that's how we came together to form this group and share these thoughts with you. As you all likely know, San Jose State University is a very proud member of the EMBA consortium. So first of all, we have Jeff Andreessen, who is the Chief Executive Officer of iCore Holdings, a NASDAQ publicly traded company that's the leader in the design, engineering, and manufacturing of critical fluid delivery subsystems and components for the semiconductor industry. And their products include gas and chemical delivery subsystems that are key elements in semiconductor device manufacturing. Next, and I'm going in alphabetical order here, Robert Cantrell is Vice President of Finance and a member of the Office of the Chief Operating Officer of Keysight Technologies. That's a New York Stock Exchange publicly listed company that serves the global electronic industry with test and measurement solutions, software, and services. Keysight has customers in more than 100 countries. It's very relevant to this international audience, and is served by a workforce of more than 14,000 employees. Next, we have Peggy Fong, who is the Chief Financial Officer of Axle-Hire. Axle-Hire builds bespoke same-day and next-day delivery solutions for high-volume shippers in major metros across the United States. Peggy has a long career prior to Axle-Hire of high-level management positions with Silicon Valley tech companies, including Magellan GPS, Fetch Robotics, OptiView, Synex, Hercules Computer Technology, and others. Next is Roop Lakkaraju, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Benchmark Electronics, a New York Stock Exchange traded company, which is an EMS, ODM, and OEM company providing contract manufacturing services. Before joining Benchmark, Roop was CFO at privately held Mana, a software company that has pioneered an artificial intelligence-driven knowledge platform. And finally, Debbie Tuck is recently retired as the Chief Financial Officer of Helix, the leading population genomics company working at the intersection of clinical care, research, and genomics. Helix played an important part during the height of the pandemic, providing over 5.5 million COVID tests. And finally, I'm Laura Roden. I'm your moderator today, and I'm a senior lecturer. At San Jose State University in the Department of Accounting and Finance. So let's start off today's panel discussion with a critical topic. Oh, one logistics detail. If anyone in the live audience has a question you'd like to ask, please put it in the live chat Q&A or live Q&A button, and we will monitor that and we'll address as many questions as we possibly can a little later in the presentation during our Q&A time. So let's start off with the critical element of all organizations, people. And I'd like to first turn to our panel and ask the question, giving workers optionality in where they work, is this here to stay? How do management techniques need to change to manage that? And do salaries and benefits or other HR policies get adjusted? And Roop, would you like to take the first stab at that?
Certainly, Laura, and thanks for having me and us on this panel. It's an interesting question because I think over the last 18 months, we've seen unprecedented times. I think we can all agree on that on a global scale. And part of what we learned as we entered into the pandemic environment is, how many companies switched to remote workforce. And I can just think about for the longest time, remote access and these sort of things were something that companies implemented but didn't broadly distribute and allow employees to operate that way. And what we learned through the pandemic is we could actually be highly effective even with a remote workforce. And as a result, I think you're seeing companies across tech, but broadly across all industries, needing to adapt to that optionality of allowing a hybrid environment. I say hybrid because there's a remote workforce, or for some of the time you may be remote, some of the time you come into the office. And I think what companies are really needing to evaluate and determine is what policy are they going to allow? Is it full remote, right? 100% remote, you never have to come into the office. Is it going to be a partial? We want you to come in for certain days of the week, or you have to be in all the time. And I think part of that depends on, at least for us as a company, what job you're in, and do you need to be in the office? I think that optionality is something we will now deal with for into the future. That's my personal feeling, and that's how we are looking at it from a company perspective. And as a result of that, there are a series of considerations that come into place. How do you organize your office environment? Do you make it more collaborative? Do you only have hoteling, or do you have permanent offices and cubes? Cybersecurity becomes a big consideration as part of that, and how that's managed effectively. And then, of course, salaries and benefits. If you're based here in Silicon Valley, but you're a remote worker in Nevada, and we allow that, well, the cost environment of Nevada is much different than Silicon Valley. So should you adjust salaries? Should you not? If someone is migrated from here into Nevada and they were at a higher salary, do you phase their salary down? Well, that has an effect because, a little bit to some other possible questions we might have, it is getting to there are labor shortages depending upon what sort of jobs, and you still need to be competitive. So how you think about this, I think, is incredibly challenging, and it's gotten more challenging. But it's that optionality, I think, is here to stay.
Well, Robert, with your 14,000 plus employees, how have you handled this, and what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And again, thank you also for having us here. And I agree with, I think Roop gave a great summary. I agree with everything that Roop said. I think one of the things that we're really trying to determine it just really has to do with our culture. What kind of a culture do we want? Because we do have this unprecedented situation that Roop referred to, and it's impacted every single person on the planet. And it has changed some people's kind of frame of reference or thinking about how they would like their day-to-day life to look. Do they really like working at home? And I think it'll be different company to company. Different companies will make different decisions, different job families, job classes, which Roop also alluded to. It would be very different. For example, many of our manufacturing employees, people that are working with physical hardware, need to be in collaborative teams, sitting side by side, working on research and development, for example. They can't really effectively work at home. But many people like me in the finance and accounting, we've been very effective. Our global team in accounting and finance has been very effective working at home. And so I think we'll probably emerge with a hybrid culture, which I think is a term that's now being used. And hybrid could mean that some of your employees are in the office, some of your employees are work at home, or some employees are work at home 2 days a week, and they're in the office 3 days a week. And then that brings this whole issue that Roop also touched on, which has to do with your physical space. How do you organize your physical space? We don't want to have a desk for everybody if some people are only working in the office 2 days a week. So it's brought up a lot of questions. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think we're going to figure it all out. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to probably end up serving our employees even better with better work-life balance overall. But we just haven't dialed that all in yet.
And Debbie, I know you and I spoke earlier in the summer because you were dealing with exactly these questions. Do you have other perspectives to add?
Yes. First of all, again, just what Robert and Rupert are saying, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. And I agree with everything they say. I think we're all going to agree, right? Because this is the world we've been living in for 18 months, and there was no other way to get through, business and even personal life, without going through those challenges. I would say, and I hate to add this to the mix, but given being in healthcare, I'll add the other thing that we had to really consider was vaccination policy, right? So we found ourselves from being a DNA company and pivoting to help the nation with COVID testing. So we, that business stalled just because of what was going on. And we said, hey, we've got some bright people here and we can come up with our own PCR-based tests. And since the last time I spoke with you, Laura, the company's has done over 6 million COVID tests a day because unfortunately the testing has been rising, the case has been rising. So we had to consider, right, since we were doing COVID testing, how do we feel about vaccination for our employees? And we were a divided workforce because you had to have people in the lab to perform the test, but then you also had, the non-lab folks, the engineers, the finance folks, the administrative staff that were working from home and having to deal with the policies of a split culture and a split hybrid workforce was really challenging for us. And luckily, we were able to kind of work through it. And in a constantly changes. I would say that not only what we had to do on the remote side, the hybrid side, but also it changed for us, I would say, almost every other week. And we were always communicating and putting out new policies as what we were doing, just because we were so in the midst of COVID in our business itself, and we had to make sure our employees were safe to ensure the nation was safe in order to get those back, get the testing out to them. So throwing that into the mix of, for instance, like our San Mateo office, and we actually also did this through kind of through a survey for the company as to how they felt, and we split in hybrid where we had in the Bay Area. The employees voted to be all vaccinated in the Bay Area versus down where our lab was down in San Diego. It wasn't as important just because of the business that we had to do, but it was in sense of any office type workers had to be fully vaccinated or work from home, and then the lab folks were there. We just had so many different protocols to keep people safe.
Policy changes, doesn't that really sum up? And yeah. When we named this panel a few months ago, in a post-COVID world, we were optimistic, I think, on that. It's not post-COVID yet. And Peggy, do you have perspectives to add?
Can you hear me now? Okay. So yeah, we're a last mile startup company. We call it typical Silicon startup company. What we do is we recently, which is starting because people are returning back to work. So we kind of have our HR policy is to right now ask each identified position, the hybrid position, the remote position, or they are in the office or facility position. So we identify each of job title and we now going through every single job title and defining which classification they are. So that's what we were currently doing right now. And once we basically saying, if you're the easy one, you're remote, you can be working remotely. And generally that is the position you were hired prior pandemic is being remotely. You can work remotely. This has been going on for working remotely. So we have positions like that. So basically say you can do it before pandemic, then you can do it now. And so then we have positions definitely had to be in the facility because, as I said, we're the delivery company, we're the last mile and same day delivery. And so we have people, gig driver, we have workers, so they had to be there. Then when the hybrid is the most difficult one. It generally in the office before, now, like finance, many positions, you're right now work very effectively. You're working from home. So like I think all of us sitting in the home office right now. So basically what we call hybrid means we actually, the way we're doing is we don't say you go in the office like 2 days, 3 days. What we're saying is you're required to go to office, but we're basically generally do not have an office desk for you. We have not just your own desk. We basically have a desk, we have a conference room. So I will require the hybrid ones to coming in, each department coming in a day. So say finance, accounting, all department coming 2 days that week. So everyone can work together, so a couple of department work together. So we have a day rotate. So this is a place we're making sure people can see face to face, make sure you can have meeting face to face, and those kind of things. So we don't have their own desk. Only maybe few, but most of them don't have their own desk. They have a desk to share desk with someone else. But ideally, is to working in the offices, able to meet up, able to have the department face to face, build out that teamwork. So that's how we currently adopt. And as I said, things been changing, and we might change our policy again. But currently, we're adopting that policy.
Oh, that's very, very structured. It'd be interesting. It could be a business school case study pretty for one of these days soon.
Right. And I'm head of HR, so I'm also HR reports to me. So this is where we kind of established with our CEO. We feel that kind of fits our current environment. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great input. Thank you. All right, let's turn to another aspect of people. So let's turn to another aspect of employees and people, and that's hiring. And there's been a lot of talk, certainly in mainstream media, about pandemic-related work resignation wave in the workforce, pandemic-related labor shortages due to government payouts and other reasons. Do you find this to be true in your businesses? Do you find it true in certain locations, certain industries, certain wage brackets? And do you anticipate that is going to change in the next few years, or is here to stay? And since Jeff was just able to log in here, Jeff, would you like to be the first to address that one?
Sure. Well, the simple answer is I would say this year we're seeing a higher turnover rate in our business, and we're in a sector that never shut down for COVID, only for a few weeks. And so we are definitely seeing it. I would say it's mostly in the skilled workers area, but we are seeing a little bit of attrition. But I'd say it's pretty normal for the professional kind of ranks at this point. I think the thing that most companies are dealing with is the wage inflation that you're seeing for some of the skilled workers. It's not insignificant. The market has moved for those types of jobs. I think opinions will vary, but a lot of companies will have jobs where we pay somewhere between say $15 and $20, and some of the government assistance allowed people to stay at similar levels. So obviously it drove some wage inflation, and now we're starting to see some hiring pick up a little bit, but I wouldn't say largely has changed. It's still pretty hard to hire folks today.
How about Roop? Have you seen significant changes?
I think Jeffrey, the way he answered it is pretty similar to our environment. Hiring is always challenging, right? And whether it's pre-pandemic, finding great talent is always a priority for any company, but especially tech companies. And when you're in environments like Silicon Valley or other such hotbeds, there's always that desire to find, and it's always been challenging. I think depending upon the industry you fall in, because of the pandemic, the psychological effect it had on folks, and whether it's getting used to being remote workers or whatever it may be, I think there's a lot of burnout. And so we have seen some higher attrition in places. We've seen people desire to retire instead of continuing the workforce. With that said, there is a tremendous demand, and we have quite a spectrum of employees from frontline factory workers, and we were a critical industry across the globe, and so we've never shut down. But we saw, depending upon the country that we were operating in, different challenges, right? And the COVID situation, the level of vaccination, the level of infection rates, all of that has an impact on the people and whether people are able to continue to work or not. And how do you then replace those that aren't able to or are on medical leave? You still need to find. And so we definitely are seeing challenges with the workforce from that perspective. And one thing that's it's going to be interesting, because I do think that the amount of money that the U.S. government, and this is a very U.S.-centric comment, it did have an effect on the labor workforce, in our opinion. And when you look at our factory workers, they range in wages between somewhere in the teens upward, depending upon the level of experience they have and skill set specifically. Well, with California increasing their wage rate to $15, does that start to compete with those? Is that, do you go work at McDonald's versus working and doing tech assembly, these sort of things. So I think there's many challenges associated with this. The net of it is their end market demand is very strong from our perspective. What we see across our portfolio of customers and industries we serve, the end market demand is very strong, which means that you need additional workforce. And so finding that workforce in a challenged environment becomes even more challenging, right?
Very, very interesting. Yeah, the differences by country also, and that, of course, is constantly in flux as well. And Peggy, now you're in the startup, the ramp up where hiring is so critical and filling out your organization. How have you been finding it?
We're having tremendous effect because I think especially for government and we're last mile delivery. So the impact for our industry was tremendous when pandemic happened. We're last mile delivery, also we're doing same day. And primary is we're only in the US and it's nationwide metropolitan we're covering. So therefore, we have a lot of gig driver or primary gig drivers, which is a gig economy. So, and we have a lot of blue collar type of a facility worker. So in our works, I would say more office, a little bit more professional job. We have the same competition as what we had before. We didn't see that dramatically change. We still had to compete as a startup, but I think we're doing okay from before or after. Right now, we're similar thing. We're still competing, but we're doing okay. The problem that got really tremendous impact is we call it more the facility or the gig driver economy. It was just you seeing tremendous impact. I was a little bit surprised by. We are growing tremendous fast due to reasons. It wasn't like we kept the same workforce like a regular of the cycling of losing worker hire. We actually had to grow because we're growing tremendous. We're doubling all the time. So therefore, we had to recruiting the facility driver. And we also have a facility worker, and we also have to recruiting a lot of gig driver. Okay, and so what we're seeing is when government, the couple of things. One is pandemic, people uncomfortable to drive. Okay, so even so they're not seeing any person. Second is the most important thing is government subsidize. We're definitely seeing that people don't want to come back to work because their income level is basically they don't want to work. They rather stay home, getting that money. So we're really had to competing and tremendous bonus increase the pay to get people come out to work. And because we're also doubling the hiring. So that definitely impacted. We're seeing definitely that. And we're start seeing a little bit better off when September 1st, the government subside a little bit going down. We're seeing toward to late August timeframe, we're seeing that coming back, that force. So what I expect 1 to 2 year right now, I always thought, this is just me. We always think the gig economy will be continue growing. Okay, there's so many laws addressing how do we deal with gig economy. Are they employee? Are they not employee? So, but there's a lot of people they want some stability, and by the same time they want the flexibility. We're seeing that more and more. So we're seeing that area. I think gig economy will continue to grow. We're seeing we're a little bit better off, but still, I think we're continually going to fight for the workforce, US. So we're definitely seeing that impact. So therefore, we're seeing more automation happening.
Is on a lot of different things. Goodness, the gig economy, the subsidies, automation, a lot of stuff to juggle, trying to plan your workforce. And finally, Debbie, any perspectives from the life science world on this?
Yeah, what I would say about hiring is definitely has been a challenge overall, especially in the laboratory, actually, just because there was a limit of the number of workers. So what was happening was there were specific technicians or kind of entry level, and we would train them to perform the different tests or doing the sessioning or things like that. And what we found is as that was happening, more and more companies were doing the same thing and kind of poaching onto our employees, and we had just spent all this time training all these employees, and so we had to put in different things to kind of keep them to stay with us. And also during the pandemic, a little touching on what Peggy was saying, because these people were just working crazy amount of hours, not just the lab workers, but business office workers as well, trying to figure out how do we do this, what's the engineering behind it, what's the development behind it. We actually increased our bonus pay for people during the pandemic and raised the targets. We actually didn't even really have the target was really, as we're going through the pandemic and we're working these, a tremendous amount of hours to make this happen and hitting these milestones of the number of tests, we actually, paid out, 2x times our bonus plan, just to help keep people staying. I did see a few people stay, not many, or I'm sorry, leave, but not many. But part of them is a lot of people were here for the mission. I guess the other thing I would say is what I also found about hiring, because it was hybrid and it was remote, we could hire outside of California. But what I found interesting is in the past, you're able to go outside the area and save a bit of money because the economy, right, just the standard of living was a little bit lower. But what we found was because there was a shortage and because there weren't a lot of people that could actually perform in healthcare and whatnot, their asking pay was equivalent, sometimes maybe even more than the Bay Area. So I found that very interesting, that before you can go out somewhere and kind of part of your company strategy was to diversify your workforce outside to a lower cost area and bring down raise the margins and bring down the costs. We found that wasn't really the case anymore. So it's been a really interesting case from that perspective.
Wow, that is, talk about unexpected surprises in your budget when you find that hiring outside one of the most expensive markets in the world can be even more expensive to go outside. Yikes. Well, that, yes? Did someone have something to add? Yeah. Okay. So that takes us into the next topic we want to touch on, which is expenses and operations. And my next question is, we've also heard a lot about supply chain chaos and shortages globally. In what critical areas have you felt this in your business? What do you think will be required to correct it? And how likely and when is that? Do you expect that to occur? And I would like to go first back to Debbie on this.
Sure. This was a stressful time for us regarding the supply chain, as I'm sure it was with everybody. You couldn't all of a sudden get things pretty quickly as you expected. But kind of a stressful but yet fun fact for everybody else during the pandemic, one of the supply chain issues we had was not having enough swabs for testing, right? And we're all like, hey, I have a box of cotton swabs at my house. Will those work, right? I mean, we were just trying to figure out what we could do. It was really interesting, to go through and figure out how we're going to do this. How do we get the chemicals, because things were not getting sent over as quickly. And so having to kind of come up with a solution there, and partnering with actually the government and because they have access, right? And I think this is where kind of your question of how do we kind of resolve this up a little bit. I think trying to get the government, right? Government split between, do we help it out? Is this a short-term thing or is this a long-term thing? But what we found was we had to go out to the government and say, hey, you're working with all these other companies. Given the funding some of the companies received, who do you know that isn't using their swabs or in their products, so that we can partner with them to get some of those swabs. And so there was a lot of you kind of forget competition at that point. It was just, hey, we need to help the nation with this pandemic. They're not doing the business that we're doing. Can you guys ship us some swabs? Can you ship us these products? And doing that, which was great. And it was a great type of partnership with the government, with all these other companies together. However, what we also found was through that time was we had to adjust delivery times and delivery schedules. And so it became this, in order for us to have enough product for Q1 of 2021, we had to make a commitment back in early Q4 2020, because it just took that long to get the supply from wherever it was coming from China or whatnot. And so there was definitely chaos in the supply chain in terms of getting enough supplies, but then also the factor in the delivery time, and then increased delivery costs, increase cost itself for the one product, right? We went from paying 2-3 cents per swab to now you're paying almost maybe $1 for a swab, right? So the impact to the bottom line, to people's financials, to their margins and for their profit, you really had to think about how you were going to adjust your budget now going forward to accommodate this, at least for the business that we were doing. And so I can go through that whole there's a whole story behind that, but definitely I think the increased cost for delivery, increased cost for the goods, totally affect the bottom line. And so it's something we had to deal with. Luckily, we didn't run out. We were able to partner, but there was a time where it was stressful, to maybe have to go to a large pharmaceutical partner and say, I'm not sure if we can do your test, in 3 days' time, because we're running out of the supplies. And so it took a lot of coordination. It took a lot of just kind of incredible resilience with the team, come up with different ideas of how we can do it. It also came down to making changes within our development team and engineering team and our QA team to say, can we do the testing a different way so it doesn't require that many swabs? So I'm sure the audience doesn't know, because I didn't know until I was in this business, that you think, okay, I'm just going to do one swab, right? I'm sure people have done testing up your nose and that's one swab. You're thinking, well, how hard it can be. For every one swab in the beginning, it took like 6 or 8 swabs to actually do your test, because they just kind of divide it all up. And so you needed more than one swab actually to do the test. And so that's why we were running out. It was because you had to do that. So it's working with the development team and engineering team to say, how can we make this PCR test better, where we're not using as much supply, but still get the same effect and the same results, to do that. So it was a lot of coordination, but really interesting time during the supply chain process at that, COVID, the height of it. But it's really, I think, going to take the government to really come together, because there is tension in government between, assessing the long-term effects to, is it a short-term thing? And so I think it's going to continue to revolve around the government to help the supply chain a little bit during that process.
It's fascinating, the inter-company cooperation that went on. It's a story we don't hear a lot about. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And Roop, you have some comments to add to this, I think.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think from a tech environment standpoint, supply chain is one of the most challenging environments right now in terms of parts availability. And I think there's been quite a bit of press about semiconductors or chipsets and these sort of things, but really the constraints around the supply chain across all major commodities, right? So whether that's memory, whether it's passives, obviously semiconductors, it could be, PC boards. So it really is pervasive across all of it. And in my 30 years in tech, I've not seen a supply chain environment as constrained as it is today. And what's I think further compounding the challenges, you have supply chain challenges as it relates to components, but then you have freight challenges. So the freight lanes are challenged, right? And there's a backlog, and whether that's air, sea, or land, freight is also challenging. And then across this, lead times are extending because end market demand seems to be relatively strong depending upon the industry you're in. And so costs are increasing both for components, but also for the freight. And so companies are really dealing with a lot of these different considerations. And quite honestly, I think it's an open question as to when it might start to improve. I think every person on this panel, I'm sure, has a perspective on when that could be. I don't think any of us really know as to a specific date by which it might happen, but it is forcing us to collaborate even more so with our customers, with our suppliers, with our partners broadly, and really understanding what the forward-looking demand looks like and how do we plan considering the level of constraints we're seeing in the marketplace, which is actually really nice because it builds stronger partnerships from my perspective. But it's a challenging environment.
I love the resilience of the executives on this panel. Debbie says these times are interesting, and Roop says this is really nice because it allows us to build stronger relationships. So it's that positive attitude is what is keeping your companies going forward and strong. Let's talk about geography a little bit. It relates to operations and also people. Is Silicon Valley, where we all are right now, is Silicon Valley really as important going forward as a physical place? There have been a lot of books about Silicon Valley and the magic of Silicon Valley, but is that changing possibly because of pandemic impetus? And have the considerations for locating a business operation or division shifted during this time? And I'd like to turn to Jeff again to address that.
Yeah, good question. Silicon Valley for Ichor is not necessarily that important. We don't have a bunch of software content and engineering talent here. Is a little more in our company spread out closer to our customers, which are geographically dispersed in the US as well as in Asia. And we have operations in Singapore, Malaysia, and Korea, and several in the US. So the Bay Area is still probably the most challenging from a cost and hiring perspective. Having said that, I think we've learned through the pandemic where somebody works is maybe not as important as is being in Silicon Valley. I think the collaboration tools that have come about have made that much more effective, at least from an engineering perspective. We have a very diverse engineering group spread across the world, actually. So that's been actually a great learning experience, I think, for us and many companies, is that you're not going to be necessarily tied to the Silicon Valley as much as we once were. I mean, in semiconductor capital equipment, there's two of the biggest companies located here, but they've also expanded now geographically as well, and then we've had to expand with those customers as well. And so we have probably 40% of our employees outside of the US now.
So wow. Peggy, your company fairly recently, in the scheme of things, went through decisions about where to locate since you are an early stage company. What are your thoughts on this? Have considerations changed for where you locate a business or a division?
Yeah, we are, put this way, we are a delivery company, right? So we are really a couple of things. If we need a physical presence around there's no change. The metropolitan of the US is where we're focused. So we're building all the metropolitans. We have a location there. So that just send us before, after our strategy. That's the type of business we're in. For the area, I think we changed some. Is Silicon Valley. Our headquarters in Silicon Valley because our founders from they're young founders from all from Berkeley, which is the school, and so our headquarters here. And what I'm seeing is the switch. I feel Silicon Valley probably, in certain way, is no longer every employee had to be hired Silicon Valley. That's been going on for a while. So I don't know pandemic changed that. I think I do see one thing. I think Silicon Valley is still our headquarters. And the hiring still headquarter employees going to be around the Silicon Valley, but I do see our employee, I don't see them moving out of state. If they move out of state, they basically change job. They go, if they move to Texas, then they want to find a job in Texas. So what I think is they're leaving out of Silicon Valley, they move a little bit more into suburbs, such as like Tracy, such as a little bit, they want more land, they want more, areas of nicer living and doesn't cost as much. I do see that, but they didn't really leave this area. And they just move a little bit an hour away because they don't have to come in every day anymore. I do see that trend, but otherwise, globalization been going on so long already. I think pandemic's not going to create that globalizing. I think it's still going on. And we have engineering in Asia, just all that I use came from industry, just that's all the same. But I do see people moving a little bit away from, used to be you want close to your office and within half hours, the best ideal case. But now people don't mind moving away an hour away, but they're not moving. If they're out of state, they change jobs. So I don't see that in our workforce. And yeah, so in that sense, I would say Silicon Valley maybe still the place because the university, there's tons, the primary, like the reason we're in Silicon Valley because our founder is from Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And I think San Jose State, Stanford, Berkeley, there's many big university and which producing a lot of entrepreneur and a lot of professional. And so still big engine. So I still see Silicon Valley with the weather, everything. In that sense, I still seeing a lot of a workforce, a lot of a resource or people will be continue still stay in this area.
Good, interesting. So you're saying it is part of the broader globalization movement. How about Debbie? What have you seen? Do you have any perspectives to add on this?
Yeah, I would say that I agree that even though we have, the hybrid approach, being able to work remotely and work here, I believe that it's still kind of the Silicon Valley, growth. You've got all the great schools around here, including San Jose State, with you got increased, right? I mean, it's crazy. People are coming here because you got the good weather, you got the jobs, you got everything like that. And so I don't see that going down at all. I think it would just be a little bit different. There's still a lot of innovation that happens here in Silicon Valley. So I don't believe that's going away. Some are moving out, but it's not going to be gone completely.
Good. Okay. And how about you, Roop?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Peggy's comments and I think are very relevant. You've got major universities that provide a very strong set of the workforce, and they're professionals, right? Whether they're engineers, whether they're accountants, et cetera. And because of those universities, I think Silicon Valley will continue to be highly relevant. I think, is it necessary? I don't think it's necessary because you see additional tech hubs that have evolved, whether that's Boston, Austin, Denver, Salt Lake City, right? New York City. So there's, and that's just within the US, and there's obviously tech hubs around the world, whether that's London, Singapore, et cetera. And so, but they're concentrated in terms of where there's really strong universities and technical workforce, right? Which is what tech companies need. So I think it's an interesting thing of whether it's necessary. I don't necessarily think it's necessary because you see more distributed workforce, distributed set of locations and these sort of things. And, Jeff made a very interesting point. It's similar for us. Our locations, our design centers and these sort of things, we place where customers seek to be. And so, proximity to customers is very important. And so that's become more distributed as well. And so I think there's different considerations to be thought through, but I think Silicon Valley will continue to be a very important part of the tech community overall.
Very, very succinct phrase used, relevant but not necessary, and also the choice in alternative tech hubs. Very interesting. Well, let's talk about another sort of related topic to location, which is the mandated shutdown of public places. We still see either instituted or at least suggested things like stay-at-home orders and quarantines for either international and or possibly even domestic travel. Has new vaccine passports either instituted or discussed for various types of businesses and venues. Has this had an impact on your business that you think is going to last for the long term or will have long-term effect? And I'd like to turn to Peggy first on this.
Yeah, that's love to answer this one. I'm the last mile delivery company, and we're the combined the high tech technology use gig worker. So you can see, and we're same day next day delivery, and you can see that shut down the public places, stay at home, definitely has a huge impact on us. Our business got really, really good. So it wasn't down the other way. It's tremendous growth. So why I would say they accelerate our growth, impact us for delivery. So what happened is people's already delivery things home on the last mile in the past. But the key thing was same day or next day was still pretty costly if you want to deliver same day or next day. So generally people can go out to buy something. When the pandemic happened, you can't. You want something delivery, especially food or something you need right away. You don't want to wait. In the past, the last mile, in the same day, next day, you basically need something right away today. You go to the store. You drive to the store. You go to the department store. You pick it up. That was the 100%. I would say 3 to 5 years ago. And when we enter this market, it's more about the fresh product. It's the fresh product which people want to send the next day. They will only pay for the extra charge. And we're seeing that happening, and Asia, China's doing that very much. They're already more ahead of us, tremendous in US. And they've been ordered in the morning, they get it afternoon. So they're getting that, because they're very city density area. And we see that coming. But what happened, that's what we're in the business, we're growing, but with pandemic, just accelerate the whole thing. So you really think about it, is in the last mile, in the past 3, 5 years ago, last mile, same day, next day, is almost 0 or less than 1% of our retail sale or entire sales of the consumer sales. So, but we're seeing that to 5 to 10% growth in the next few years. So you think about a huge amount, trillions of dollars spending in growing in the 3 to 5 years. And we're definitely seeing that. So that has a huge impact about people, how you're getting your stuff, your consumer from grocery to any item you're talking about. You're seeing in the past, we're saying, oh, something I deliver from Amazon. They put the Prime, they're putting 40-hour delivery. Amazon putting the standard 40-hour delivery. Right now, certain thing we need the same day. So we see that whole acceleration, the growth. I don't think we'll come back. I don't think we'll go the other way around. After the post-pandemic, I continue to see that growth. The growth may not be as accelerated as what we used to be, but they'll continue in the very fast growing, be people used to that. Because even China was, when they got such a high same day delivery, it wasn't because pandemic, so the pandemic definitely, but they were already there. So I seen that impact accelerated, people got used to it. So I definitely see that as a long-term for our business.
A lot of sense. How about Robert? Have you seen any of that impact at Keysight?
We actually have not. We were, I'd say, other than the impact it has on all of our people, which is like everybody is going to feel that, because everybody feels restricted and people are going through all sorts of different cultural things that the pandemic is driving. So we have that generic impact on all of our people. But we were declared essential pretty early on, and so we've been open for all of our physical players, our manufacturing and R&D folks, just kind of subject to all of the local laws of distancing and masking and things. And so it really hasn't affected our business operations nearly as much as it has other companies.
Good. And how about Jeff? How about at ICOR?
I think ironically, this is one of the biggest years. It will be the biggest year our company's ever had. Last year's was the biggest year it had, and so this is all being driven by the semiconductor demand. And So I think some of this is been very beneficial. It's very challenging to operate in this environment, but it's accelerated a lot of secular changes in the world. You know, and at the base of a lot of that is a semiconductor or a chip, which drives our business and some others on this phone call. And so it's actually been surprisingly the strongest environment that I've ever seen in semiconductor in the history that I've been doing it. I've been doing it like 30 years, and from a year-to-year ramp, we're looking at somewhere in about 30% growth in the underlying equipment that we sell into. And so that's kind of unbelievable to think that you could do that in the middle of a pandemic. And I think it happens because of the global supply chain and global companies, and our ability to move things around. And we've been affected by shutdowns. And, you know, we operate in Malaysia, which, you know, went from almost no vaccinations to, by the end of October, they'll have 80% of their population vaccinated, and they probably started in June in earnest. It's quite amazing. So it's amazing how quickly things adapt in these environments. And I don't want to live through it again, but it's been quite interesting. So.
Oh, I'd second that. And Debbie, how about you? Have you seen other perspectives on this?
Yeah, you know, I had my notes written down here for this question. Is kind of Jeffrey and I are spot on, and that is, and I think with Peggy too, right? We didn't. It's been a banner year, for healthcare companies, for companies here. But what was difficult was the constant change, to the employees and the internal changes that they had to go through, that we all had to go through for during that shutdown and stay-at-home orders. You know, deemed, are we deemed essential? Are we not essential? Do we have, it was interesting because the fact that we did the test, we didn't have direct contact with, the patients. You're technically really not deemed essential, but then, again, as I mentioned before, policies were changing weekly because of what, CDC or the government was saying, and became essential. And so for us, it was really the constant changing for the employees, and having to readdress policy, and having to recreate, the way that we're doing business. I think that had an effect, as well as for employees themselves at home, right? A lot of people were single, parents, and how could they come into work, right? And they didn't have anyone that could come and take care of the kids. And so a lot of different changes for the employees, and trying to figure out, a lot were multi generational homes. And so it was the constant of ensuring that they weren't going to, or that they were being protected, but they're going out and then coming back home, right? And, make sure they're not with grandma. And so it was a very, I think, emotional time for our employees to navigate through the closures, because they had to go to work, to do this. So for us, it didn't affect our business, but affected the employees. I would call it just mental health, and and affected the employees day to day, their operations, how they live their life. How do we deal with it? We actually even talked about, do we bring in a daycare center on site, right? How do we help our employees? How do we make them, a little bit better, from the personal perspective, because they're doing so much for us from the work perspective. So that's what I would say, how it affected us, not on the work professional side, but more about our employees and their mental health, and how they're going to adjust through during this time.
Wow, really, really important points. Yep. You brought up, as well as I think it's been brought up several times already today, and I'd like to focus even more on, is how do you do budgeting and long range so-called planning in this environment? So many of the students who are with us today, working on their MBAs, many of their jobs are going to involve budgeting and planning, a traditional MBA focus. And any tips or suggestions on how you do that in this time of enormous um, change. Some parts of the business accelerating, supply chains, troubles, all kinds of things going on. I'd like to ask Robert to address that first, if I can.
Yeah, Laura, thank you. The first thing I'd say is I'm really glad that it's not March or April or May of 2020 right now, because when we first realized just how significant this impact was going to be globally, my job basically became daily integration of cash flow forecasts and budgets and operational aspects of our business, and figuring out a model and figuring out a way to present that to our CEO and our CFO. Pretty much, not exaggerating, sometimes it was on a daily basis, just trying to keep track of what was going on. So I'm really glad that that's behind us. But I'd say the one thing, well, a couple of things that we learned. First of all, is there were, in our case, there were a lot of costs that that you wouldn't think of that went away automatically once the pandemic hit. And the biggest example is travel. And we're a global company, and I can't tell you how much money we spend on travel, but I can tell you we spend a lot of money on travel for sales and research and development and other things. And pretty much that went to zero. So we hadn't really anticipated how much of a hedge that would be on our earnings. Just as one example, there were a lot of other examples. So there was a lot of new learning that even as a seasoned veteran, I've also been in the electronics industry for over 30 years, and really considered myself to have seen it all and experienced it all. I had not seen nor experienced anything like this. So there was a lot of learning. I'd say the number one takeaway for budgeting and long-term planning is that most MBA students will spend some amount of time working in an area called scenario planning. And I definitely studied that when I was in school. I've seen it done, I'd say, more academically in the workplace, but not always utilized and not always implemented. Sometimes you'll do scenario plans. They get, as we jokingly say, they get put in a binder. The binder goes on a shelf, and the binder never comes back down. But I would say that the COVID pandemic was the perfect time to actually work on real scenarios, real scenario planning, and actually have an opportunity to execute on various scenarios as we learned what was happening and as things panned out. And that applied both to our short-term budgeting, our quarter-to-quarter management of our business, where different things were happening. Maybe a different flow chart emerged and we needed to go down a different path. But we've also applied that to our long-range planning. And we're right now in the middle of our strategy planning season, and we will be presenting our strategy plan to our board of directors this month. And I can guarantee you it is going to have some very real scenario planning, and the board will probably pay a lot more attention to it than they have in the past. So that's been the number one learning, I'd say, Laura. Scenario planning is valuable, and sometimes it becomes very real.
Can you tell us how long your long-range plans go out at this point in the future? 3 year, 5 year?
Sure. Our typical cycle, and Keysight has a legacy that goes back to the Hewlett-Packard Company, for people that don't know that, and we've borrowed a lot of practices from Hewlett-Packard, and that's where I started. And our typical long-range plan is 3 years. And so that's where we do extensive planning over a 3-year time horizon, but we do our market modeling. In other words, just our top line, but not like our full-blown cash flow and P&L. We'll do top line modeling and market modeling that could go out for a decade. So we try to understand our cycles. We've talked a lot about semiconductor cycles. We're heavily dependent on semiconductor cycles, and there's a lot of science and study of semiconductor science that we rely on heavily. And so we will have market models that have to do with mobile phones and wireless devices and a number of things that impact our top line. And we'll try to look at all of those variables and integrate those and get kind of a picture that unfolds about what the top line is going to look like over the next decade. And then we boil that down into a 3-year full-blown financial plan.
Fantastic. That's fascinating. Let's see. How about you, Roop? How about at your company?
Yeah, I want to echo what Robert said. I mean, scenario planning is of the utmost importance in these sort of environments. And maybe what should be taken out of this is the challenges. Scenario planning is always necessary. And whether that was pre-pandemic or in today's environment. With that said, the volatility of the scenario planning and how extensive you really need to think through this, right? It can't be just a desk exercise. And I would encourage, especially MBA students, to look at it cross-functionally and actually get out into the business and seek inputs from those in engineering, right? Those in supply chain, those, all of the different areas, marketing, et cetera. And really take those inputs in and evaluate what scenarios are we really needing to think through. What are the drivers of the different considerations and how might they impact our business and our business model, right? And I think that's especially challenging. And when you then start to say that's the P&L, but one of the things that I think most companies I think really started to think about is cash, and do they have enough cash? And how are the markets going to think about you needing to go out into the marketplace? A lot of companies drew down on their revolvers just to strengthen their cash on their balance sheet, right? And these sort of things, even if it meant they were a little bit more leveraged. So scenario planning is not just P&L planning, but it's balance sheet planning, right? It's cash and cash flow and these sort of things. And so really taking it from a cross-functional perspective and having them actively engaged in that scenario planning, I think is critical, which if you're doing effective planning, you will do. And whether that's, to Robert's point of the quarterly forecast analysis and what you might provide for guidance to the street and these sort of things, or it's your annual plan or strategic plan. And depending upon which of those areas you're talking about, the horizons in which you look at things will be much different, right? And if you're looking at strategic, you're going to look at technology roadmaps and how that might change and how that could influence your business and your business model. And then you adjust accordingly associated with that from your overall planning perspective. And then depending upon which constituency you're talking about, if I'm talking to our employees globally, then I give them a certain time horizon that I talk to them within. If it's our board, it's a different. If it's Wall Street, it's something different. Right, and so who your constituency is, I think, will alter what horizon you're going to speak to them about.
It is a complex time, calling for some pretty complex solutions to address it. Jeff, what about budgeting and planning in your company now?
Yeah, well, I don't think I can add much more than what Robert and Luke talked about, other than to say I think that all scenario plans and all long-term forecasts, the one thing we all know is they're wrong. So you don't, particularly in semiconductor, no one could predict out 3 years, but you have to understand the underlying drivers of your business and the assumption sets, because if we all look back to that March, April timeframe that Robert talked about, everything changed instantaneously. And the one thing, the scenario plan to me, that's the easiest, and probably most of you guys would agree, is the downturn plan. You've got a playbook, you know exactly what to go do. It's when to pull the triggers on the upside versus other things. And when you're in an industry that's growing 30%, when we entered the year, most people thought it would be 15, 20. And so you're readjusting capital plans. And, we recapitalized the company. We did a secondary. We pulled down the revolver through all of this. And we wanted to make sure that we had a really solid balance sheet as we went through it. So those are the important things for the students to kind of take away. You got to understand the business and the business driver. The scenarios would come out of that. So.
Points. And before we leave this topic, I'd like to go back to Debbie, because Debbie, you had already cited some extreme examples of how your costs of goods have changed beyond expectations, as well as your demand. Would you like to add anything on here to your how that's impacting your processes for budgeting and for long-range planning?
Yeah, just to reiterate what everyone else has said, right? Scenario planning was definitely very key in what we were doing with cash flow. As we were doing, the testing, right? The money doesn't come right away. So we're having to really balance, that was, a little stressful, but, managed through that. I would say the other thing that, students should be aware of too is when we talk about scenario planning, it's also developing the relationships cross-functionally with the other departments to really understand what does supply chain look like, what do they, how long do those people feel that it's going to take, to get supply, 2 years, 3 years, so that you can develop a really good model and develop a good scenario in your planning. So developing those relationships, to me, I think are, one of the key things that you need to do when you're developing any financial model is to talk to the sales folks. What does it really look like in terms of the sales cycle? How long does it take them to close a deal? What about what's in the pipeline? Talking to marketing about what they're doing. Really developing those relationships, I think, is really beneficial to get a really good plan together so that you can fully embrace what your business is doing. So of all the things that haven't been really said, to me, that's one of the key important parts besides what everybody else has said already. I'll just add that one little tidbit.
Thank you. Well, we have time for a couple more topics, and I think that we will go ahead and talk for a few minutes about financing. Roop brought up the importance of cash planning in this environment. And so I'd like to ask, right now, and for the past several years, we've experienced very, very low rates on corporate debt financing. And we've seen the impact of that on how companies are capitalizing their balance sheets. Looking at your crystal balls, is this going to continue? And how are you looking at that for your businesses? Are you trying to maximize, lock in long-term leverage at low rates? Or are you, on the other hand, trying to finance more conservatively because the future and as the present are so uncertain? And I'd like to turn first to Robert, if you'd like to address that.
Yeah. So obviously we have a lot of friends in the banking industry that provide us with opinions, and I don't even profess to be an expert in predicting these types of things. All I can say is that low interest rate is a relative phrase. And what we're seeing right now is obviously unprecedented, and it's been low for quite a long time. And all of the models and my ability to wrap my mind around those models would say that interest rates are going to stay relatively low for some time. They may go up from where they are. They probably will. But how high are they going to go? Most of the predictions are they're not going to kind of go screaming back up. They're probably going to stay relatively low. So it's a great time, and there's already been some mention of this already being done. We've already done some of it, but it's just a great time to consider your capital structure. It's a great time to consider your cost of capital and to make sure that you have your house in order. While there's an availability of cash, there are lenders that are willing to provide cash, and they're willing to provide it at low interest rates. It's just a great time to get everything in order. So I guess my general answer is that I predict that that rates will probably stay somewhat low for a while, which is that's kind of like the answers that our bankers give us. So I'm giving you the same answer.
Oh, but very good advice on getting your cost of capital house in order. How about you, Jeff? How about at your company?
Yeah, in the last since the pandemic, I think like many companies, we drew down on our revolver. But what I would tell you is the rate environment today is the rates are as low as I've ever seen them. The amount of money to be put to work by the banks is as big as I've ever seen them. So there's a lot of aggressive approaches to what I would call bank debt or institutional debt. We also did a secondary. We carried a relatively high level of debt versus kind of the size of the company. We wanted to recapitalize it. And we did that about December of last year virtually, which was, for those that know how painful those can be non-virtually, that was a great way to do it. You know, you get to sit in a room as opposed to fly around and talk to 50 investors or something like that. So I personally think that there's one metric that I always look at. You know, the banks, as Robert says, will give you their forecast, but I always look at employment. And if employment, unemployment gets really low, that's usually when you start to see rates and inflation and stuff get going. And we're at 5.5% unemployment. 2% of the people in the workforce have left it. So you're looking at 7 or 8%, apples to apples, pre-pandemic. So I don't think there's going to be a rush to tighten the belt. They're going to keep the money flowing. So I think interest rates are going to be down. So I have no problem in going back out and refinancing debt or anything that's on my balance sheet. So.
Good. Now, how about you, Peggy? How is this affecting you in the early stage company world?
As I said, we're early stage. The financing, most of our financings come from our fundraising, right? So we raise a lot of capital for our growth. We're very light asset company, but at this point we're using the fund primary into a lot of automation. Getting a profit generating, and most of our funds are for the growth. Startup company, a lot of your funds going for growth, especially growing like 2-3 times, 2x, 3x. So primary we're using that, and so we don't really have a lot of the actual debt type of financing. We don't, because we're raising a fund. Our funds are very just quite we have quite a bit runway. So I don't see that. But at the same time, I do echo everyone saying I don't see interest rate going up fast, especially where we are right now. I think we'll stay relatively lower, this kind of low interest rate environment for a while. And we're definitely going to using more debt financing instead of to go out fundraising more. That will be our planning as a startup company, and definitely something we will be considering. At this point, we don't have the need. But we would definitely to use that in the year or two, so we don't have to go out diluting more of our share. Yeah.
Good. Very helpful. Well, we have time for one last question today, and I'd like to make it sort of a capstone question and call on each of our panelists to address it. And with all the different factors and moving parts we've discussed, what are the implications for management style and organizational structure? And that's something that probably every one of our MBA students is going to play an important part in the decision making they have to do in years to come. And I'd like to start with Roop on that.
Yeah, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, I think the workforce environment and how companies are approaching the workforce is evolving today because of the pandemic effects. And, from a management style, I think for those that have been accustomed to being able to walk down the hallway and speak to everyone face to face, that's a more challenging environment. But what's interesting is you have to get to know your employees, whether you're direct employees or across the company. Relationships are still critical. And what's important from a management style perspective, or manager's management style, is how are you going to get to know your employees, your peers, and up and down the organizational structure, right? And because at the end of the day, business is done through effective communication, collaboration. And whether you're remote or not, that's still required, right? And when I walk into a meeting, I want to make sure I've got all the constituents in that discussion, because I want perspective. I want that diversity of thought. And if you're only accustomed to walking down the hall and finding the only person in the office because everybody else is remote, well, that doesn't work too effectively. So I think people are going to really need to adapt. And companies are also going to need to invest in tools to help enable this, right? And I think this is also why you see many companies that I know of are doing a hybrid approach. And for those, when you're coming into the office, what we're encouraging and what I encourage my team is, come into the office when others are coming into the office, so you can collaborate, so you can still develop that relationship and talk about things, and not just stare at a screen with different, tiles of pictures and these sort of things, because everybody's remote. So I think that management style is going to evolve, but ultimately, that development of the employees into the management levels and to the executive levels is really predicated on not just subject matter expertise, but how well you connect and communicate and collaborate to deliver results. And as you go up the ranks, that is of critical importance. And the only way I've seen it done effectively is by developing those relationships cross-functionally across the company, and these sort of things. So I think it's still going to evolve further, and companies are still figuring out how to continue to do it effectively. But it is of critical importance for all of us to figure out how to do it effectively. But each of us will look at it maybe slightly differently, or have our own nuances because of our own culture or our own structure and these sort of things.
Good points. Really good lessons to take away for our EMBAs. I'd like to call on each of the rest of the panel to address any comments to this, but I want to point out that we do have a question from the students that asks about culture and how you deal with instilling or maintaining culture in the new post-COVID world, and also productivity. How do you encourage it? How do you assess it? So think about that as you're making your final comments here. If you want to address anything about productivity and culture, please address that as well. So I'd like to turn next to Debbie. Would you like to make some final remarks on this?
Sure. And it's a good question, and it's a good comment that Rup was making about ensuring that the managers are being connected with their team. We've made it a point to we actually survey the employees often about, are they feeling connected with the company? Are they feeling connected with their team? And ensuring that for those kind of departments that aren't ranking high in their scores, is that we're working with the managers to give them the kind of the management training and the tools to do that. But I also think it's on the employees to ensure that they're reaching out to their colleagues as well to kind of bridge that gap. In terms of productivity, what we also encourage is, not that we all want to have another Zoom meeting, but we encourage, now that we can go back into the office, is to at least go in the office, every other week, or at least once a month for a team meeting. And it's not like you have to be there all day, but we ask that that they do that to be connected for at least an hour or two, even go to lunch or whatever if they feel comfortable. And just checking up on people. Productivity, is somewhat easy to gauge, right? Because we continue to set our our key objectives, right? And ensure that we have the goals in place for folks and the things that we do. And so there's always a check-in. We have every other all hands meeting with the company. We go over kind of the results of what's happening, but then we also go over, some of the key objectives of each period of time as to what we're doing, and it helps, keep people connected. It's definitely been an impact to the culture. And I have to say, it's been really interesting through this pandemic phase is, it appeared that we didn't have a really high culture score at the beginning of the pandemic. And given that we had to really work hard to communicate with each other via Zoom, via, Slack, whatever, communication mechanism we had, our score actually rose really high. And so it was kind of an interesting thing to see, and it made us feel good that we were communicating, and we did. As I mentioned before, we were having constant policy changes, but we would be communicating those changes, every week, or we would have, kind of a weekly update of what's been going on. Originally, we had a weekly all hands meeting, and then we moved it to every other week. But I think, and we also had these we call it kind of fun things. We did, scavenger hunt over Zoom. That was an interesting one. We did a lot of different kind of games just to connect people. We did happy hour, right? So everybody grabbed their cocktail or non-alcoholic drink, and we were on Zoom, and everyone's just able to just talk, not about work, but something else. And so I think that really helps drive the culture when you see the tone from the top, right? From the CEO, CFO, the founders, and everybody kind of doing that and doing what we could to make it easier for the people and help them see that it's not about work. And then we also had to instill to the folks that, hey, we know you have things going on at home. Like we ended up putting a policy in place that said, if you are not going to be speaking, you did not have to be on camera. So if you had to go take care of your child, or you're listening, but you had to let the dog out or something, we didn't require you to be on video. So we had to make a lot of adjustments. And I think that really helps the culture, helps the employees see that we cared about them and that we wanted them to be successful during this process.
Lots of good stuff there. I think I'll just go to Robert, Peggy, and then close with Jeff. So Robert, comments on management, culture?
Yeah, just real quickly, if I could integrate what Debbie said and what Roop said, then that would be an excellent answer. I think that the future of management continues to be the same as the past. I think it has to do with being a great leader. And when you're leading larger and larger groups of people, they're going to be diverse. They're going to be different. And so I think the key thing is that you have to be capable of listening. You have to be capable of integrating differences and bonding different groups of people and people with different perspectives together for the best possible outcome. And that's going to take flexibility. It's going to take adaptability. It's going to take great communication skills. And a lot of these, when we're recruiting from MBA schools, we kind of assume that you have all the technical. We throw in a few technical questions just to check, but we assume that you got that. And what we're really interviewing for and listening for are this whole area and what I call soft skills. And that's kind of a generic term. And what does that mean? But it means the things I talked about: flexibility and adaptability and the ability to communicate, the ability to integrate ideas. And so I think that will continue to be the future of management, the future of successful management. And I think that thankfully we're finding that most of the MBA schools that we recruit from are doing a great job of preparing people for this brave new world. But do pay attention. I'm glad we're having this webcast on the post-COVID world, and I look forward to getting to the post-COVID world. And I'd say we're getting closer and closer. Maybe not quite there yet, but we've learned a lot through the COVID pandemic, and I hope that we all listen. I hope that we all pay attention to what's happened and to what can happen, and I hope we all learn from that and become better, and that will make us better managers.
Robert, and thanks for bringing up the recruiting points too. Very, very important topic. Some of our EMBA students may be in the jobs and careers they want right now, and others might be getting this degree as part of a considered change. Peggy, final comments?
Sure. I think for the productivity or effectiveness working remotely or not in office, we have not seen any reduction, or actually seeing even better productivity. And so, but what we have seen is a lot of it is your problem solving. You're talking about each other through Zoom or Google. It's very effective. What we're seeing is, I think, still, so we're seeing two things. What I see is one of it's, as Ruth said, you lost that relationship, you lost that understanding how each person's personality. And so therefore, you lost that soft thing. So if you've been working together before closely, and then you don't have that issue, just work from home for a year, because you already know that person's styles or how they behave. When they say something, you understand what that means. Already upset or don't upset. So you have to be very careful what you say sometimes. But the most important thing I think the difference is new employee. Being a startup, we have a lot of new employees coming in. So new employee, they never work. I have people work for me. I interviewed them. I never met them in person, okay, ever. and they weren't in town, so I had to bring them to my home to kind of know that. But anyway, so you do have a lot, and so I see more HR issue. I don't know anyone else do, but I do see more HR issue, all related to new employee coming to the, especially being the manager. So the staff they're managing, they didn't have that relationship building. They didn't know I said something. You may not be as happy, but I really don't mean that. But if we work together, you're building that relationship, you know what I mean, right? So we're definitely seeing a person got a new manager coming in, and they're able to integrating it, to working as a team that's soft, and I think goes away. I don't know goes away completely. It takes longer to build. So I definitely seeing more HR issue related to this area. I think this is where a company, and we are actually seeing that. So we're going to start building, we're going to spend the time to train and build and to make them come to the office a couple times to build that relationship. And I think that's the part. And the part I also see a little bit less without doing this way of not working together is lost that creativity. I feel there's more discussion when you work together, more relaxing, you're more this. But when you're on the phone, you're under this kind of video, you're a little bit away. So you don't have that creativity as much of a creating together creativity. I think that two thing with that. So what we do is we'll start building. We require people coming into office, the hybrid one, to really, especially new department, we require them doing a little bit more things. And also, I think people do miss about social, because the office in the past, you go in there, it is a social, not just work environment, it's a social environment. So I do feel that piece of it goes away. And we as a company, do we want that still? Is that going to help productivity? Or because people like the social? And so that's the part I think is all the companies have been challenged to think about it. We believe we still want to build a little bit of that. We want to keep that, so the hybrid becomes important. That's what we want to. We don't want you coming separately. We want to come all together. Department come together, so you have that environment. Yeah.
Good points, Peggy. And Jeff, any icing you want to put on those comments?
Those were all great comments, so I don't want to repeat them all, but I think, as if I was to give some of the MBA students that were going to think about changing jobs or moving, the assimilation into a company in a remote environment is challenging. I think Peggy kind of hinted at that a little bit. It's a two-way street. Bigger companies will have a whole bunch of online assimilation, but that's not assimilation. You don't understand the company's culture. You don't understand what they're about. You've got to build those relationships a little bit differently. Keep in mind, we're going to be remote for a while longer. There's going to be a hybrid, and maybe we go back to something that's still hybrid. We don't know. We all just don't know where it's going to go. I think it's going to be dictated a little more about our employee base and things. And obviously, a company like us, we have 2,200 employees, and 1,800 of them make things or build things or put them together or weld them or whatever. And so those jobs are a little more clearly defined and assimilated. But when you look at our turnover, it's all in the first year, right? And they come and they're just not. You don't get them bonded into the culture, and that's what keeps people around. And I think that changes. And I think that Robert touched on it. That's leadership. It's been a big challenge for companies to transition. Like, for instance, me as the CEO, I would go to every site almost every quarter and do all hand meeting. I can't do that now. I can't get them in the same room. So, and I couldn't do it for 15 months or something. I was pretty locked down from a travel perspective. Done a few of them now, but they're smaller groups. So you're going out, and it's hard to carry the message. You do a lot of it online. The happy hours, we did a lot of those early. Those kind of died off. So that's I don't know about you guys, but that whole social stuff, we tried to keep that together as a senior team in the company, to keep that camaraderie. Because it was a big thing for me to adapt, because I'm a walk down the hall guy, and I don't want a meeting. I want to go talk for 10 minutes. I want to keep this moving. I don't need to have a room full of people all the time. And so I actually use my phone versus texting. So, that's maybe that ages me out a little bit. But I think from the culture question, it's this just proved out our culture. It was quite apparent, when if you never, wrote down what you thought your culture was, you can do it now. I guarantee you, as you've weathered this pandemic, you know what your company's about.
Thanks so much for that great wrap up. And in our remaining seconds, I want to thank each of our panelists, as well as the students and the EMBA administration, for coming together today and sharing this opportunity to talk about the post-COVID world. And everyone, please stay well. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.